Ormerod and myself, David Goodhart, are here. We have coming in online, we have Ben Houchen, Mayor of Tees Valley. We have Hazel Blears, former Labour Cabinet Minister. We have Jessie Norman, former Financial Secretary to the Treasury. And sorry to you three for keeping you waiting, but we are finally here to discuss the great Levelling Up White Paper, which was also delayed, but did finally come out last Wednesday. To, I think, sort of broadly positive response. I think a lot of people, particularly in the policy world, were just relieved not to be talking about Partygate any longer. There are obviously plenty of caveats to the broadly positive reception. The Labour Party said there wasn't enough money, or it was all our ideas anyway. The free market right didn't like it, they found it too statist. A lot of people, particularly the Wolf family, found it over-ambitious, Martin and Rachel. The kind of snootier end of the wonk world tended to see it as sort of George Osborne devolution married to New Labour targets. But I think it's a pretty serious piece of work, and we've got some serious people here to discuss it. What I'm going to suggest, we've thrown this thing together at rather short notice, so I haven't even really had the chance to plan things with everybody, but I think if everybody talks for sort of 5 to 10 minutes, certainly no more than 10 minutes, on their thoughts about the white paper, and then perhaps we can have a bit of a discussion, if the technology will allow it, between our panellists, both here and remote, and then we will throw it open. We have a small but select audience here at the Policy Exchange offices in London. If I could ask perhaps Ben Houchen, who wrote an interesting response to the white paper himself on Conservative Home this morning, particularly focusing on this whole question of further devolution and fiscal autonomy and what that might mean. If I could ask you, Ben, perhaps to kick off with your thoughts.
Yeah, happy to, David. Thanks for inviting me on at short notice. Always happy to work with the Policy Exchange. I mean, the Levelling Up White Paper for me, I largely agree with what you said. I mean, you're never going to make everybody happy because everybody wants different things. But it was better received than I thought it would be. I think having a definition of what levelling up actually means, one thing I didn't hear when the Levelling Up White Paper was announced, that nobody really understood what it meant to the government anymore. I think the government has been very clear in its 12-point plan around health, wages, job creation, place, all that kind of good stuff. It's pretty clear on what it's trying to achieve. So the ideas are good, the themes are good. It does a very good job of explaining the problem. You would argue that actually we already knew what the problem was, but it still explains it pretty clearly for those that didn't necessarily. But it needs to go, I think, a little bit further on the delivery model and the delivery plan for that. Now, you could argue that it's a white paper, right? So it's not necessarily going to have every single minute detail worked out, but we need to see that delivery plan pretty quickly. The themes for me, which I was expecting anyway, devolution clearly plays a very key role in how the government believe it's going to deliver levelling up, and it's looked across the country where we have devolution deals, where that's worked well, where that hasn't, and how they can be seen potentially as a delivery mechanism working with government to be able to deliver the outcomes that they're actually trying to achieve in the area. Again, fantastic. We want to get more devolution deals on the line. Wasn't overly clear on how we were going to achieve that. The only glimmer that I saw really was around county deals, which are potentially very interesting how they work out. There's obviously a sliding scale now within the white paper of powers depending on how far local areas go with devolution, whether that's a county deal or right the way through to a full mayoral combined authority. So that gives us a bit of an indication. But beyond the large counties where you would expect county deals to come forward, of which a few are named in the white paper, it's difficult to see how we address the same old problems of devolution, especially given that the government haven't pulled the trigger on imposition of devolution locally. So it still requires local agreement to take forward. So I'll be interested to see over the next few weeks and months how that pans out to make sure that as the government has an ambition to get the whole country covered by devolution, which I think is pretty important. the funding element part as well is really interesting. One of the things I found really interesting, even being a mayor of a devolved area, just how many different funding pots we feed into. And it does feel sometimes like, as a devolved area, there is this schizophrenia with central government that they want to give you more powers and they think that devolution is the right path forward, but they don't necessarily trust you with all the funding to be able to do that. Now, I'm not kind of on the extreme ends of either of that scale, because I also appreciate that devolved areas like mine are still relatively new. I can be quite honest and say there are some things we do well and some things we don't do particularly well. So I get with central government, there is this idea of an earned autonomy, prove that you can do what you have with the powers that you've got and the money that you've got well, and then you'll get more. So it'll be interesting to understand in the coming weeks, because it's not quite clear from the paper, how we can kind of meet the requirements of the government, build that relationship and go on a journey of more autonomy. But as I think Harry Phibbs actually said in response to my piece this morning, there is a bit of an alphabet soup of funding that could be streamlined through mayoral combined authorities or devolution deals, which currently it talks about redirecting them to us rather than necessarily simplifying what can be quite a complex system. Again, largely what you pointed out as well, David, I also did feel that actually it does address the funding, subsidy, government intervention side pretty well. Let's be honest, I mean, levelling up by definition is a government policy looking to readdress imbalance within our economy. Now, by definition, that requires a level of intervention, both from a regulatory point of view, powers point of view, but also a funding point of view. So I appreciate there may be some kind of free market purists out there who believe the market should just be left to its own devices. I can understand where they come from, but by definition, levelling up can't do that because it requires government to readdress that balance. I would also say that we don't have that at the minute, especially when you look at things like research and development, how much of that government money is funneled into the south of England, particularly around the Golden Triangle. You would argue that actually the south has been subsidised for many, many years. So, that's a more complex picture, that's a very simplified one, but it's not a level playing field now. So I think it does pretty well there. I think there's some more clarity over funding. Like I say, direction of travel with devolution. The bit that it did miss out on, and this was what I was trying to talk about this morning, is there is more that it could do around deregulation and free market economics. It could do more by giving more powers to local areas. Like for me in particular, I think that I appreciate there are complexities about rebalancing and how much, for example, the Tees Valley would get to central London on this, but the devolution of things like business rates could be a powerful lever to attract investment without costing the government huge sums of money. And we've all seen what happened with the corporation tax rate when it went down from 28 to below 20%. Yes, the rate of tax was lower, but the actual take for the exchequer was higher. I think what we've already got in devolution is a bit of a competition emerging. So we specialise in what we do in Teesside around big energy production, big net zero industries, big manufacturing. Manchester are fantastic at things like IT. London have financial services. So you're already seeing a bit of competition in the public sector here. I think there'd be something quite powerful about competition within the tax system and a bit more of a federal view of that. And I think that ultimately goes back to Treasury. And I think it's a Treasury official issue that we have a lot of pure economists in the Treasury who will rail against that. And we saw that again with the government's Freeport policy that we all know wanted to be more ambitious and could have been more ambitious, but was watered down to, I suppose, a basic model to prove the test because it was very difficult to get the officials in the Treasury to see it as any different from basically a supercharged enterprise zone that they weren't particularly keen with. So I think all in all, if I was to give a summary, I think it's a good step forward. Themes are correctly identified. I think if you spoke to the person in the street, they would absolutely identify that is what levelling up is. Funding needs to come with that. Government get that. Where that funding comes from and how much is still to be decided. More powers to local areas to decide for themselves. Again, all very, very good. But I think we've just missed a bit of a trick in the white paper looking at some more creative, non-monetary requirements for devolution, particularly around tax. And that largely goes back to that point that I made about earned autonomy and whether the centre trusts these potentially new devolved areas to be able to make decisions for themselves. So I'm really positive about it. Looking forward to seeing what comes from it. I'm sure we will get some more devolution deals, but I think there's still a way to go, which will take many, many years to make sure that we do level up the whole of the country.
Okay, thanks very much. It's a good opener. Could I ask you, perhaps, Hazel, to go next? I mean, we're clearly something that more or less everybody has praised the white paper for is the accountability regime it's put in place, which I think does set it apart from much of government policy. But what people have, perhaps particularly people on the left, have said it lacks any kind of long-term funding regime to match that accountability regime, and maybe it is only a white paper, so maybe perhaps in the kind of the next stage we could have that. Is that the sort of thing that you'd be looking for?
Yeah, thanks very much for inviting me to take part in this. I think it's actually a really kind of topical, resonant debate, because it's the future of the country. So it's got grand ambitions. I actually do quite like the 12 national missions. Maybe 12 is a bit too many to be able to really push on, but nevertheless, they cover the things that are important about pay and productivity and health and well-being, all of that. I have to say it was slightly reminiscent. If I think about, when we came in as a government, we actually made the statement that we wanted the people in the poorest areas not to be seriously disadvantaged simply because of the place where they came from. And that then influenced a whole raft of policies from Sure Start, New Deal for Communities, Decent Homes Programme, housing market renewals, city deals, neighbourhood renewal, that whole panoply. When government is new, it's got all that energy. It can lead to a bit of confusion, but nevertheless, there was a real push. What I like about the white paper is about the accountability, the measurement, the fact that we're going to have to report on exactly what progress we make. And certainly when we did the New Deal for Communities, there's a lot of scepticism about it, but actually it saved 5 times more than it cost because it actually got people back to work. So I think, really looking at this virtuous circle you can get into, if you do spend some money and you improve things for the poorest places in the country, then you get greater productivity, you get greater return on your economy. And actually, it's not about giving people charity, it's about giving them the investment they need to make that kind of transformation. So there has to be some funding behind it. And I know how difficult it is to get funding for policies that are across government departments. I think you've got to have a really strong centre here from number 10, from the Prime Minister, saying that all departments are going to sign up to these programmes and really going to give a kind of corporate push from government as a whole, because without that, it'll just be fragmented and fractured and won't make the kind of impact that you really want to see happen. So I know how difficult it is sometimes to get cabinet colleagues to agree to put their budgets into things that you've promoted. I've no doubt that Michael has sufficient diplomatic skills to be able to make that happen, but it will be quite a big challenge. I think that the devolution stuff is going down the right path because it's giving people more local decision making, but also doing it in an incremental and gradual way where people actually prove that, Ben's phrase was earned autonomy. Absolutely right. You've got to be able to prove you can use the money well and wisely to make the difference, and then you'll get more and more powers to be able to do that. I think there's going to be some simplified bidding processes. I really do hope there are. We were very guilty of complexity in some ways, so the more simple we can make it and the more transparent we can make it, the better. On the money side of this, obviously there's not a lot of government money about, but I think people need to be more creative. I chair a social investment business that actually is the longest existing social investment organisation in the country. We provide patient capital for voluntary sector, social enterprises, community organisations, help them grow to scale, to begin to provide some of the vital public services around health and well-being. Mobilising that social investment sector, which has now grown considerably with people like Big Society Capital, the dormant assets. We're going to have the next tranche of dormant assets coming along. With dormant pension funds, all of that kind of thing. If we were able to twin social investment with the new emerging mainstream impact investing market, mainstream capital now is desperate to be able to exhibit the social, economic and environmental impact it's making. ESG has become absolutely the norm and expected. So if you've got social investment, you've got mainstream impact investment. And then the third element is pensions for purpose, beginning to mobilise those massive pension funds. If every local government pension fund did what Greater Manchester has recently announced, which is to spend 10% or to invest 10% in local regeneration, that would amount to £16 billion extra to be able to invest in transforming those communities. You know, which pension fund members would not want to see better homes, better communities for their sons and daughters by mobilising those pension funds? So I think there are some creative ways in which we can not just have public money, but we can have this capital market out there that is waiting to invest for impact. My other point really is I want to see as much emphasis as we can, not just on infrastructure. We know government ministers like to go and put a hard hat on and a high-vis jacket and open a road or a railway or something you can see and touch and feel. But actually, unless we invest in people, all of my regeneration experience tells me if you don't change the way that people can aspire to lead better and healthier lives, then in 10 years' time, you'll be back where you started. So I'd like to see more on how we invest in people, how we help them transform their own lives. We see more community ownership of local assets. That's now pretty much an accepted thing. At first, when it first came around, community-owned pubs, community-owned health centres, you know, bizarre. My white paper, a long time ago now, was entitled Communities in Control. You empower local people, they will amaze you what they're capable of doing and how they can get value for money out of it. My final point I wanted to make was that I was delighted to see in the white paper a mention of arts and culture and how that can drive regeneration. We only have to look at the Angel of the North. We look at places like Margate with Tracy Emin, the Dillawar Pavilion, all the places that have been City of Culture. And actually, if we can push on and really bring not just investment in infrastructure, but investment in beauty and arts and culture, and get that to drive the economic regeneration, or at least part of it, then we'll actually create places where people want to live, to work, to bring up their families, and the whole country will benefit.
Thank you very much, Hazel. Jessie, we can turn to you next. You'll have been glad to see a mention of your innovative Hereford University in the white paper. But I wonder if perhaps you might be less enthusiastic about the way that the white paper seems to have, I mean, if it's created a political conflict, it seems not so much down the normal Labour-Tory division, but kind of within the Tory ranks between I mean, it's kind of exposed the fault line that's been there perhaps since 2016, particularly since 2019, that maybe the party hasn't had enough time to debate between the more kind of social democratic red wall strand of the party and the more, you know, lower tax, small state instincts perhaps of southern Tories. I mean, there was a vitriolic piece about the white paper by Alistair Heath in the Telegraph, and you know, as Ben said earlier, I mean, there clearly is, and as he himself wrote in Conservative Home, there is a feeling that perhaps there's too much emphasis on kind of Labour-type targets and state intervention in the paper, and not enough on how private enterprise itself drives this forward. What was your thinking about all that?
Well, thanks, David, and thanks also to my fellow panelists, and they've both said a great deal of very interesting stuff. And I do want to respond, though, to some of the questions you specifically put. And I do think that this is a white paper. Obviously, it's very long, it's detailed, got a lot of analysis in it, it's got some history of, and all of that, I think, is rather interesting. And it is true that in some respects, it has a slightly statist feel to it. And you see that, for example, in this kind of inputs theory of R&D, as though just the amount of spend to R&D would be enough to sort of drive economic growth. I'm not sure that that's true. And I think the conventional wisdom, which is that R&D take up overwhelmingly driven the margin, I would suspect, by, or should be by, private enterprise and activity, that should be really the driver of it. And that's the first point. I suppose the second point is that there is a feeling that in the white paper that, as it were, the private sector, it has its own section to it, but in a way the private sector is an enveloping whole to the whole process. And I wonder whether that's been fully conceptualized or fully articulated. I think what's quite interesting about it, there's a whole bunch of stuff that's really interesting about it. The first is that I think one can consistently hold, I mean, of course, being attacked by Alistair Heath is a bit of a badge of honor in the world of industrial strategy. And so I don't really think that's much to worry about particularly, but there is a balance to be struck, it seems to me, between the very important function of the Treasury in holding government spending to account, restraining budgets where possible, to some extent acting as the bank manager because that's what the finance ministry is supposed to do, and but also, of course, there is an embedded conflict there with what you might call the more growth-oriented venture capital side of the equation. And I mean, Paul will have forgotten more about this than any of us, but I think it is very possible that one can combine those two viewpoints and say that actually in certain contexts, it is possible to build long-term regeneration by a process of essentially Hazeltinian bringing together of local interests, pushing party politics out of the way, demanding as a precondition of activity a degree of local broad-based support, as well as party political support, making it private and voluntary sector led, and then articulating a long-term investment program which matches to some extent, or at least acknowledges in a staged, milestoned way, what the private sector and other agencies within the private and voluntary sector can do to make progress. And I think if you do that, actually the sky's the limit. And Hazel's absolutely right that it's amazing what local energies can deliver. Now, in the case of someone like Herefordshire, my own county, very low gross value added, very sparse population, smaller than London Borough of Camden, one of the lowest levels of economic, some of the lowest levels of economic activity in the country. There just simply isn't enough capital in the county to be able to deliver a sensible levelling up agenda. And there are plenty of other places around the country where that's true. But what we have done has been to try to build a long-term economic strategy based on skills-based higher education, and to put a new model of a university at the center of that. And you visited it, David, and we were delighted to see you. And I hope you saw that there's a kind of energy that's created, which is infectious in the marches, but also potentially provides a model elsewhere in the country. I think of it as the small modular nuclear reactor of higher education. So that's just how we're trying to do it locally. But I think that model, essentially that Hazeltinian model, if it's properly adopted, and if the government is sufficiently self-aware about allowing it to, as it were, experiment and to take the best energy that's been generated, and to be quite brutal about saying, well, this place does have the right levels of energy and we're going to support it. That's what Ben's doing. And other places around the country and other places perhaps not, and perhaps they need to redust off their plans or rethink how the entrepreneurial energies locally are going to deliver it. I think there is a place for that. Now, the other thing I suppose I would say is that, of course, that does demand of the Treasury a slightly different mindset, not just the bank mindset, but what you might call the venture capital, the growth mindset. And I think it also marks an interesting potential development. If what comes out of this is not one department, but two departments, DLUC and Bays, which can over time become real champions of growth within government, then I think there could be a really interesting discussion within government as to how those different priorities work their way out. Because I do think that one of the problems we have is we don't have enough champions for the private sector. We don't have enough champions for local entrepreneurship and energies. And it's quite useful to have that. And if it can be complemented by some more devolution, again, in the way that Ben's described with some earned autonomy, then I think that's potentially a very attractive thing. And if alongside this blend, you can fold in a specific focus, not just on infrastructure, which is correlated with growth, but skills are much more correlated with growth. Skills are the thing that's really going to drive long-term productivity. And if we can have a skills-based agenda, and in particular, an education-based agenda that includes all of those aspects of arts and culture that Hazel has touched on, then that will do something very exciting, because it'll vindicate the Levelling Up White Paper's ambition, not just to deliver productivity growth, but also to recognize those place-based aspects, those aspects of pride and of history and of tradition that do so much to inspire people and to get them energized, and have done so in the past in this country. And I think all of those things together potentially adds up to a very potent mixture, especially if we can make it more increasingly private sector led, because that's really what's going to drive long-term growth.
Great, thank you very much. Last but not least, we have here in the studio in Policy Exchange, we have Paul Ormerod. I forgot to mention at the beginning, Paul, you are not only a world-renowned economist, you're also chair of the Rochdale Development Agency, and I'd be very interested in your thoughts. You gave a very good talk here on levelling up in one town just before Christmas. How do you think the white paper is going to affect Rochdale?
Oh, well, thanks, David. I think I was delighted to see in the Sunday Times yesterday a headline saying, "Take a look, Rochdale, it could be you in 2030. Data used by levelling up officials say towns should aspire to be like affluent Richmond upon Thames." Well, since I live in both places, I think that's a very worthy aspiration to have. I think I'd slightly disagree with you, David. I think the white paper got quite a sceptical reception, in much the same way, I should say, the comments on this particular article were, but they're misplaced. I think the point about the state intervention is that many local areas have become trapped, if you like, in a low-level equilibrium of low productivity and low incomes. So in principle, market forces, incentives and so forth, can bring them out. In principle, that could happen. But these market forces in this particular context seem to me to operate almost with glacial speed. They take many, many decades to work through. Because areas like Rochdale and other areas like that in the country, we've had cheap labour, we've had cheap land for decades, and the problem persists. And so I think a recognition that the public sector kickstarts the areas out of this seems to be, to me, an important recognition. But having said that, of course, in terms of a sustained growth path of higher productivity and higher incomes, only the private sector can provide that. And it seems to me from the coverage that it's been mentioned again today, the main criticism of the white paper is there simply isn't enough cash. And it's true that many of the announcements of cash in the white paper are referring to programmes that had already been announced. There is some new money, and I can't, a final point, we might be getting that. Seems to me that fiscal transfers within a monetary union of sterling, are perfectly proper. Economics accepts that. But the point's already been mentioned as well. The problem with anybody advocating more public spending in the current situation is the small matter of the £500 billion of additional public sector debt that the government have taken on through pursuing their policies of lockdown. That's bound to put a constraint. We have to be realistic. But yes, I think the thing I like about the white paper is that it does set out a innovative analytical framework for thinking about how to revive these regions. And it's something that we've been trying to do in Rochdale. The idea that there are many factors and they have to work in combination. We have to bring all these things together. And it's described, this is an analytical technique I've been keen on for many years and advocated, I think, as Jesse might know, something called complex systems analysis, and it's actually mentioned quite substantially in the white paper, so I very much welcome that. And I think, again, the missions, it's not just a matter of the accountability, the way in which governments have said, yes, we'll be accountable, that the missions are aspirations. And all successful companies realise that to succeed, you have to set clear and ambitious targets and visions. And again, that's what we've been trying to do in Rochdale. We're saying we'll try and recreate the conditions of the first industrial revolution to the fourth, and we'll base it around precision machinery and new materials, like the first one was. This case, it's not textiles, it's graphene at the University of Manchester, and we've made smarter technology. So to try to bring all these things together. And I was very pleased that Hazel mentioned culture, that we adopted a policy, well, resolution at our recent meeting of the Development Agency Board only last week to actually push forward and make arts and culture a priority in our reliable strategy, as well as high technology. But I think that just two final points. I think for me the most important one is to devolving powers as to how money's been spent. It doesn't mean that local people will get it right, but the local knowledge required seems to me more important and more valuable than trying to impose a top-down strategy from Whitehall. And this is particularly important in terms of, for me, what's a central part of levelling up is levelling up within regions, because a point I made in my talk in November, and Andy Haldane had made it, one of the authors of the white paper, had previously made it in a policy exchange point, is that levelling up within regions is much more important than levelling up between regions. You know, the disparities in incomes and productivity within the Greater Manchester region are at least as great as they are across the country as a whole. And giving people the power locally to deal with that and devolving powers even further seem to me to be an excellent way forward. And I think finally, and again it picks up a point that Jesse made, I think there's a reinforcement of success. Again, a point coming back to a talk I gave a couple of months ago, to say you have to start somewhere, but you can't give everybody the same chance initially, because levelling up is a massive programme that's going to take decades. I mean, it's taken the West Germans, 3 decades and at least 2 trillion euros to make any real impact on levelling up East Germany. So it takes a very long time, and so concentrating resources in the areas which have already shown initiative and shown they're willing to work within this framework seems to be a much more effective use of taxpayers' money than scattering around almost at random, which has been characterised a great deal of regional policy in the past 5 or 6 decades, really regardless of which government's been in power. And the innovation accelerators of industry academic clusters based on the models in America around Silicon Valley and Stanford and Boston and MIT, this is being reinforced in Greater Manchester, West Midlands and Glasgow. And of course there's extra money there, and from a Rochdale perspective, we are a policy priority within Greater Manchester. So from our point of view, we very much welcome the white paper, but more broadly, I welcome it because of its innovative way of thinking and to get people thinking differently about how to carry out successful levelling up and successful policies.
Thank you very much, Paul. Just a couple of things I'd like to kind of dig a bit deeper into and just ask for any of you, how many of you? 4. Any of you 4, what you think about. I mean, first of all, there is this whole question of fiscal autonomy. I mean, I think Michael Gove, even since the publication of the white paper, has spoken rather positively about that. I mean, I'd be interested perhaps to talk a bit more about, Ben mentioned business rates. I mean, how would that work? What's the likelihood of it happening? But the other thing we haven't talked about very much, and I think is perhaps the most disappointing part of the white paper, is education and skills. As Rachel Wolfe pointed out in a piece she wrote, it's at one level extraordinarily over-ambitious. I mean, one of the 12 missions being raising primary school standards to 90% of the accepted rate of reading and writing and so on. The current level is 65%. I mean, there is no discussion at all about how that might happen. There is kind of implicitly quite an emphasis on graduate retention. I mean, the first 4 words of the report are stay local, go far. And yet the one innovation educationally in the white paper that I could see was free school sixth form colleges. Sixth form colleges is a route to university. It takes kids away from if you're trying to stop, bright young kids from leaving and not coming back, which is often the case, then that didn't seem to me consistent with the thrust of the report, and it was very unambitious actually in terms of improving technical skills and so on. I mean, anyway, I don't know whether anyone wants to chip in on either of those 2 points. Ben?
Yeah, just briefly on both of those points. I mean, I suppose I can say this a bit more freely. It's one of the things that being a mayor does. It gives you a bit more autonomy than maybe an MP does. I think one of the kickbacks around training and why it's not as detailed as it should be in there, because you're right, it could have gone a lot further. And it was also a problem with the original devolution deals, is that DFE as a department is completely anti-devolution. And even now where we've got post-19 devolution of adult education post-19, it's pretty prescriptive. Yes, we can move kind of funding about a little bit, but they've got us on a short leash. And the department needs a radical shake-up to be able to do that. Now, that's battles within government, that's secretaries of state, that's different departments or the Cabinet Office or somebody being able to corral DFE to the table. But I suspect that's why, and again, that's my complete guess, but I suspect that's why it's not as prevalent as it should be. Now, that's a problem for us because as we do the big infrastructure stuff, as we start to attract the private investment through the Freeport and all of that good stuff, we're now having a conversation internally where our biggest problem, our number one thing on our risk register over the next 5 years isn't creating jobs, because we know they're coming and they are actually already coming today. It's making sure that local people are skilled to get the opportunities to get those jobs. And at the moment, it's a very difficult thing to be able to square that circle, which we can go into more detail. Very, very finally on the business rates bit, I think something happened in the white paper that's probably let the cat out of the bag a little bit. And I think it's difficult to put the genie back in the bottle or whatever kind of example you want to give. One, when I was consulted on the white paper and asked what type of things would I see from a mayoral point of view, and I talked a lot about tax devolution. And there are already levies that we can put on. So there's transport levies we can put on, there's mayoral levies we can put on, and that very much acts like a Police and Crime Commissioner precept or a council tax increase. It's not really anything other than just basically putting more tax burden on local taxpayers. So I asked the question, well, if I'm allowed to levy by say 3%, can I reduce it by 3%? And the whole thing went completely silent. So I think there is a real tension within government at the minute about what it wants to do with tax devolution. And one of the reason why I think the genie's out the bottle is actually one of the things that was detailed in the white paper was the fact that there would be a power coming to mayoral combined authorities that allows you to increase business rates in one sector to allow you to decrease it in another sector. One, nobody's going to use that power. I can't see any mayor or mayor saying we're going to tax you in the hospitality sector more to give a tax break to big corporates in the energy sector or vice versa. It's just not going to happen. But what it does is it's now sent a signal from government that that is in play. And I think now that they've signaled that that's in play, that might not happen tomorrow. It might not even happen in 3 or 4 years' time. But that is an indicator now from the centre that they are potentially up for that conversation. I think one of the reasons that business rates didn't go further in the white paper was the fundamental issue that, the business rates tax take in the Tees Valley is significantly lower than that in the GLA. So how do you address those equilibriums? Because if in effect you're also devolving the financial take that you get, then you have to do some sort of kind of status redistribution model. So I think they're finding it in this instance finding it very difficult to get their heads around how that would work in practice. But that acknowledgement, mayor can increase and decrease business rates, albeit in effect it's got to be net neutral, I think has let the genie out the bottle, and I think in years to come will be the starting gun for tax devolution in earnest.
Great, thanks. Hazel and Jesse, can I come back to you in a few minutes? I just want to open it up, but you will have a chance to make some final comments, if that's okay. could I have, I think we've got Andrew Adonis, former head of the Infrastructure Commission and Secretary of State for Transport, sitting in the front row of our small but select audience. Andrew.
Thanks. A really, really interesting discussion. Lots of interesting thoughts here. The big, bold change to the Government of England that's taken place in the last 20 years, which the White Paper gives a further shove to, is the introduction of directly elected mayors. And I'm a strong supporter of it, because my view is that political leadership is one of the decisive things that contributes both to good policy and to marketing place. And therefore, having identifiable leaders is hugely important. And whereas I couldn't begin to name, I don't think I could name for you at the moment the new leader of Leeds City Council or many or Derby Council or Leicester Council, but I certainly know who Ben Houchen is, and the fact he's here, shows that the profile is there. However, and this is the point I'd welcome views on, though I welcome it in principle and want to see it pushed further, and I hope that Michael Gove does use these new county deals to get more mayors. I mean, in places like Cornwall, like County Durham, like Derbyshire, I think that will be a big boost to them. The fact of the last 20 years is that the only mayor that's clearly worked in terms of driving substantial growth is London. The only city that's had a really clear growth trajectory in the last 30 years, actually, since the late 80s, has been London, which has consistently outperformed other cities and regions and continues to do so. The tables about capital investment formation, business formation, all that in the White Paper show that. And it is clearly the case in London, from my experience working closely with all of the mayors of London, that it's the combination of the ability to really drive public investment and attract private investment together, which is crucially important. And the Mayor of London is at least as important for what the interaction with the private sector as the interaction with the public sector, even though almost all of the discussion in this event has been about the public sector and how mayors and public authorities can bid for public funds. So I'd welcome views, particularly from Ben and from others, as to how mayors in places which are, quote unquote, left behind and don't have the dynamic growth which London has got, can actually, in a really turbocharged way, market their own areas to the private sector, because it seems to me the bit of the mayoral equation that hasn't worked yet, clearly, is producing private sector growth. What we're still talking about, to coin a phrase, is cakeism and dividing up a public sector cake, which can get you so far, but as Paul rightly said, with the levels of debt and all that we've got, that is not going to be a goose laying golden eggs in the next decade.
Thanks. Well, do you want to just quickly come back on that, Ben? And perhaps Hazel and Jesse can chip in if they want to.
Other people have got more interesting things to do than I do. Andrew makes a very good point. So, one of the interesting things that people don't know about what I do, I spend probably 75% of my time speaking to private investors. I'm sat in meetings trying to encourage them to come to the region. We're trying to, I am Teesside's best salesman. That is a big part of my job. And people don't see that until we ultimately attract the investor and then announce it. But they don't see a lot of what goes on behind closed doors. And it is this, people confuse me with being some sort of this kind of social democrat, big state Tory, this red wallism, which I don't particularly buy into. It's the pump prime, given the levelling up agenda, it's the pump priming of areas that have been left behind to unleash the private sector, energy and potential. That's what levelling up to me is about. So when we invest in, the former Redcar Steelworks, or we're investing in putting a Freeport in there, all of those things don't produce anything in and of themselves, but it makes it more appealing to the private sector to come in and take up the charge for levelling up. So you're absolutely right, Andrew, and I think you'll see in Teesside in particular over the next 12 months, a lot of that will start to come to fruition. But it is that pairing with how do you use the levers of government to attract the private sector investment. And then that's where the accountability comes in, right? Because then Treasury need to assess that using that public money, say, £10 million, is that a good use of money if you're attracting £500 million worth of investment and 1,000 jobs? Now, to me, instinctively, that feels like it's a pretty good way of spending public money to leverage that kind of thing. And if you're doing that in the private sector, putting that kind of deposit down to leverage that private finance would be a fantastic deal to do. So I absolutely agree. And this is also the benefit of devolution, as others have rightly said. It hasn't worked in some areas so far. And you can argue whether that's down to whoever's been elected or the structure of those mayoralities in and of themselves, and some have. And again, there'll be some competition between those areas around good practice and learnings that will help as well. That's another aspect of devolution that people don't talk about. You're actually introducing a level of competition into the public sector that wasn't there before.
Paul, do you want to quickly come back to Andrew?
Andrew raises an important point, but if I give an example of local political leadership that worked, that's Manchester itself, not Greater Manchester, which of course was led by Richard Leese for many years as a leader. He stood down at the end of last year. And he transformed the centre of Manchester. That 25 years ago, you couldn't live there. There were no houses, no flats. Now 80,000 people live there. It's been completely transformed under imaginative political leadership, working closely and bringing in private sector investments. My flat in the area is up on the moors in Rochdale. You look down and there are just cranes everywhere, red lights everywhere in the centre of Manchester. I think it's a little bit unfair to criticise existing mayors because they haven't had a long time to bed in, but I think it is happening, certainly in Greater Manchester. Just to give one point, which again I mentioned at Policy Exchange a couple of months before, in the mayoral elections last year, Andy Burnham won every single ward in Greater Manchester at a time when, in the local elections were held on the same day, many Conservative candidates were returned to local councils from the wards that Burnham won. So it does seem to be there at least. It is coming together and starting to give the sort of leadership which you so correctly identify as being a vital ingredient in success.
Good. Before I come, I haven't forgotten about Hazel and Jessie, but let's just see if the technology can work sufficiently well to have a question from our online audience. The thousands of people out there who are listening or watching on their screens, who, well, you better select. There are a couple of names. Bear with us for a sec. I'm sure it's going to work.
Ask her to unmute.
Sorry?
Ask her to unmute.
Could you unmute? Who is it? Helen Dias. Helen Dias, if you're there, could you unmute and say something? No, not working. Shall we abandon that? Well, why don't I come to Jessie and Hazel, who have been waiting for a few minutes. We'd possibly come back to that. Is that all right, Oscar? Hazel, did you have any thoughts on things that have been said?
Yeah, thanks very much. I was just going to say, Oscar, I think that Howard Bernstein must take a fair share of the credit as well as Richard Leese for Greater Manchester. But we were absolutely delighted that in Salford, I think Media City is now going to be doubled in size, which is a fantastic investment and a transformation from the old docks. And I think more people are now employed on Media City than ever were when the docks was at its heyday. So you can see how change can happen. I just wanted to say a word about disparities within regions. I now live in Cumbria, which is very, very different to the kind of metropolitan areas. Its geography is very rural, it's very remote. Young people are leaving because there's not the kind of nightlife and art and fun that they want to have. And so I think the disparities is a really big issue for levelling up, disparities within regions. We've got next door the Lake District, which is very prosperous in many ways, absolutely beautiful. And yet you get to West Cumbria, which has a history of, hard graft and mining and nuclear and science and engineering. It's a fabulous place for innovation, but isn't necessarily keeping the young people engaged in the way that we want to see happen. So I think there are some specific problems to be tackled there. One of the things that hasn't been mentioned, and it is in the white paper, is using the power of public sector procurement to get things to change in some of these areas. Public sector procurement's about £300 billion a year. Sellafield up in the West Coast and BAE Systems now increasingly adopting social value as a way of getting inward investors, not just to come and make money, but also to make a really positive commitment to skills, to training, to health, to education, to all of those things which make a great community. So I think that the whole issue around social value is going to be another way of getting more money into the pot. And I took the Social Value Act through Parliament, one of the last things I did with a Conservative colleague, and it's really got a lot of traction up there now. So I think that the white paper as it stands, the missions are good, the accountability is good, but I think there are going to be areas of the country that really need a particular, maybe a kind of more bespoke way of looking at how you're going to get them to break through, because they don't necessarily have the mass that you need to make those big steps forward. But that doesn't mean that those people should continue to be left behind. We've got to be more innovative about how we really bring the investment in. Just finally, one of the things we've set up in Cumbria is called the Invest in Cumbria Alliance. And if you want to come to Cumbria and invest and make money, that's a great thing, absolutely great. But as well as having a commercial contract, we want you to have a social contract. We'll help the investors with what a social value proposition looks like. And whether you're bioscience or nuclear or engineering or whatever, you have a responsibility, not just a moral one, but a tangible economic responsibility to build that place, to be the kind of place people want to live, work and bring up their families. So I think that's a key role for business, and I've been delighted how open people are to that approach. That isn't a big statist approach. That's saying to business, come on, if you invest here, actually you'll be more successful because people will have the skills you need, and you'll be able to make better returns because you've improved the community at the same time.
Thank you, Hazel. Let's just have one more attempt at going to the online audience. We've got Vernon Bogdanor of King's College. Vernon, are you there? It's like a seance.
Yes, can I be heard?
Vernon.
Yeah.
Speak.
Well, can I be heard, David?
Yes, I can hear you.
Right.
Speak up.
My question is this, that obviously levelling up requires devolution. It can't be done from an office in Whitehall. And I'm very sympathetic to the idea of mayors that Andrew Adonis mentioned, and also to the devolution of much more power in skills, further education and adult education to the Cinderellas of the service. Though I think more important than that are speeches from ministers that you cannot anymore leave school without qualifications and hope to get regular employment. That mindset still exists. But the question I want to ask is this. It seems to me only central government can secure a fair balance between the regions, because otherwise the balance simply depends upon the political clout of particular mayors. Now, how are we to draw up principles to decide the balance between central government and the regions?
That is a good question. Shall we just take one more and then perhaps have a final comment from our panellists? Well, let's go out to Nico MacDonald, South Bank University. Nico, are you there?
Yes. Hi, David.
Hi.
I just had a question about the R&D component. I've been involved for a long time with the Research and Development Society, and we follow closely the industrial strategy, which obviously had a close focus on R&D. We've talked a bit today about graphene and investment in R&D. I just wonder how the speakers, particularly Paul, feel about the approach to R&D, given the recent historic challenges the UK has had with R&D, of not being able to invest, certainly not to grow companies from that R&D, and often not to be able to connect, universities, which we've been talking about, with industry in a way which really creates breakthroughs.
Good. Okay. Well, why don't we... Actually, that also reminds me that we have another Levelling Up event in the Levelling Up talk series that Paul spoke in back in November, we have Richard Jones from Manchester University talking about levelling up R&D and innovation. On Wednesday, lunchtime, it's a lunchtime meeting, 1 o'clock. We'll put out another invitation to that for anyone who wants to join, either physically here or remotely. Richard Jones on this coming Wednesday. Let me. We're coming up to the end. I think I should really just ask all of you to respond to either of those two questions or make any final comments that you want to. Jesse, do you mind going first? You haven't spoken for a while.
No, quite. Okay, well, no, I'd be happy to. So let's just pick up a couple of things, several very interesting points that have been made. First of all, David, well done to you, because this has been a really interesting event, and the whole levelling up agenda has been taken really intelligently and seriously by Policy Exchange, which is great. And also, frankly, it dovetails beautifully with your own recent work on this, and on kind of, as we're reaching out beyond the cognitive elite and trying to kind of bring much wider conception of talent into play. And certainly one of the things we found with NMIT, our new university in Hereford, is that when you start thinking about skills-based education and you think about pulling people in who can do the course, but recruiting for other skills, creativity, resilience, teamwork and the like, you get a much wider, more inclusive group of young people. And I think if we can make that a kind of theme in other forms of regeneration, in some of the respects that Hazel touched on, good citizenship as well, I think that's a really important aspect. One of the things we've learned, goes to the point about innovation, Richard Jones has been talking about, is that you don't just associate innovation in this kind of education with graduates and postgraduates. You know, we've got this Centre for Advanced Timber Technology. We're going to be doing lots of innovation there, which is about making new timber composites work, but that's stuff that will happen, it'll be done by what we would historically have called undergraduates. So I think it breaks down some of those idées fixes, idées reçues about what, you know, where the dividing lines are. Very quickly, to Andrew's point, there are lots of pockets of regeneration success, and we need to be really smart and clever about picking them up beyond London and other cities. You know, Lincoln is a classic example. They put a university in there in 1997 and saw some movement, really took off after 2010, makes a contribution now to the national economy of hundreds of millions of pounds a year. There's a good regenerist study on that. If anyone's interested, you can find it online. What I think that also does is to remind us that local capacity makes a huge difference. And one of the things that is really interesting about mayoralties is some are really building capacity and others aren't quite as much. And the same is true of local authorities. And one of the things governments really think about is how it can use the work it's doing to build capacity. When I set up the UK Infrastructure Bank, one of the things we were doing was specifically trying to help, you know, organizations, local authorities, mayoralties, which have capacity to really pour some petrol onto the flames as quickly as they possibly can, but also to bring the folks that don't into the picture, so that that knowledge and that excellence can be shared, given that resources are constrained. Same thing in relation to tax. Ben made a point about tax devolution. I think you know, a mayoralty that can show the Treasury that its tax take is going to remain steady, but its growth is going to go up, is a mayoralty that's begun the process of having a conversation about how it might want to tweak the balance of local taxation. But those are going to be conditions precedent, I would have thought, and they'll have to be pretty credible. Otherwise, certainly the Treasury, quite rightly, and I say this as man used to be responsible for tax policy, it's going to take an interesting, good, hard look at it. Final point, I do think that you know, it's very hard, to Vernon's point, to think of a digested set of principles that you can use in any recipe-like way. The closest I've come for regeneration is the principles that I mentioned earlier on of Michael Heseltine's, but there does have to be a kind of connoisseurial aspect. Judgments have to be made about which areas have built capacity adequately, which areas really do have a thoroughly well worked out, well bought into economic strategy, and which areas are going to reward that marginal public investment, as well as massively triggering private growth. And that involves expertise inside government, and not just expertise about spending money, but expertise about judging private sector activity. And I think that's quite a difficult thing to do. And it does make it hard to reduce to a single set of specific rules.
Paul.
Yes, if I could just at one point on the R&D point, I'm pleased you mentioned Richard Jones, the University of Manchester, giving a talk here on Wednesday. Of course, the Rochdale Development Agency, we work very closely with Richard, and one of his close colleagues just recently joined our board. So we're working very closely with the academic institutions. But of course, one of the things we're talking about all the time with Richard is not just the R&D, and I'm pleased to see this was actually mentioned in the white paper, is the diffusion. It's not simply a question of carrying out the research or one or two advanced firms doing it, but to set up a framework which encourages the adoption of advanced technology in a longer tail of less productive firms. Just as are less productive regions and towns, there are many less productive firms, and diffusion is one of the key things that we're discussing with Richard in this R&D context.
Great, thanks. Final word, Hazel, and then very final word for Ben.
Yeah, on the devolution side, I think there has to be something about more results, more devolution. But I think that the civil service need to take a fresh look. When I first went to Parliament, I persuaded John Geith, who was then at the Treasury, that he ought to come and live in Salford for 6 months and look at our regeneration and help us with that. I found him a lovely terraced house in the middle of a fairly tough area in Salford for 6 months. And then we agreed on this because civil servants didn't really understand what it was like living in a city place with massive crime and gangsters and goodness knows what going on. And then right at the last minute, he had to come and see me, and he said, Hazel, he said, I'm really sorry, he said, but I'm not going to be able to take up my tenancy. And it was one of the biggest disappointments of my life. And I know that Policy Exchange has recently done some excellent work. I was part of the commission looking at how do we get civil servants really to understand what it's like in these different communities right across the country. And I think it's an unfinished piece of business. And I know many civil servants would absolutely want to do it to inform the policy making, the way in which they're making decisions. The big issue that Andy Burnham really struggled with on the devolution agenda was about health and social care. And he was the only deal, I think, that actually got some of it, but it was quite minimalist in terms of how much you could devolve health and social care. And if you think how much that contributes to productivity, to quality of life, all of those issues, and I think that that's the big thing yet to be tackled, is how do we get more local decision making over health and social care. Andy wanted to do a year of care, give me the budget for a year of care and let us decide how that, with families, decide how that is spent. And I think we would have got much better value for money if we'd been able to look at health and social care in a holistic way from the patient's point of view and their family's point of view. So there's a lot more still to be done, but devolution, absolutely the right way forward.
He's there. Ben, quick final word?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So, I mean, just following on from what Hazel said, I mean, it's one of the reasons we pushed so hard to get the Treasury to come to Darlington, as well as the jobs. It's that different outlook. And one of the things that the white paper does address, it'd be really interesting to see how these things are embedded, because it's one thing doing it, it's another thing actually getting them embedded and making them sustainable, so that in 4 or 5 years' time, the civil servants don't say, well, we tried it, so it's failed, so we're going back to London. The white paper does set out a big chunk of that, so that was really pleasing. Again, the devil's in the detail. It's the delivery plan. How do you make it sustainable, not just in Darlington, but across the regions as the government starts to do that? I do think special thanks needs to go to Jesse on the UK Infrastructure Bank, because Tees Valley was the first recipient of that. So thank you very much, sir. And we worked very, very well with them. And to see two public bodies in effect working over an 8-week period to deliver a £107 million investment on commercial terms, I think is pretty unique, to be fair. So I'm sure that will continue. So thanks to Jesse and his team for doing that. Very quickly on the two questions, the gentleman talked about how do you continue to balance all regions. I think the beauty of devolution is you don't. There will always be winners and losers, in that there will be areas with strong political leaders who implement their plans more effectively than others. And then there'll be a learning of best practice. So, we will always look at what the West Midlands or Manchester are doing. And I hope that they would look at what we're doing, because let's all be grown up about this. I don't have all the answers. Andy Burnham doesn't have all the answers, Andy Street doesn't have all the answers, but it's how do we see what each one of us is doing and take the best parts of what everybody's doing that is relevant to our areas. To try and get to a point where every area is equal on every outcome of those 12 outcomes that have been set out in the Levelling Up agenda would be a bit too statist for probably even the most ardent socialists. So it'd be a difficult thing to do. I think there's a whole separate conversation that I'm sure the Policy Exchange will do in the future that we could do around research and development. I mean, this whole rebalancing of things like UKRI, Research UK, how they actually put money into institutions. And if you look at the figure that I look at, that is pretty stark, and it's an oversimplification, but it just gives you the scale of the problem. The golden triangle from government money into universities and catapults, etc., over the last funding period received just over £1 billion worth of funding. That's government money going into the south of England. Now, you can say that's fine because it's supporting the amazing work that places like Oxford, Cambridge and the private sector is doing in that region. Over the same period, the Tees Valley got £7 million. You know, that disparity is huge. The issue for a lot of this R&D funding is it does seem to be, by and large, predicated on just academia. And what we try and say to the government, to BEIS, to the likes of UKRI is actually it's about the spin-outs as well. So it's taking that academic piece of work and commercialising it and scaling it up in an area that has the skill set to be able to scale up, for example, things like hydrogen and CCUS and all these other net zero technologies. And I think there's a big blind spot in the way that UKRI funds these other types of innovation that it doesn't recognise outside of the academia of very hardcore spin-outs from big universities like Oxford and Cambridge. But again, that's probably one for another day.
It is indeed. Thank you very much to everybody here, everybody listening online, and to the four speakers, of course. Sorry about the technical hitches and the slight delay at the beginning. Just to repeat, you know, this is a really big issue for us here at Policy Exchange. We have ongoing lecture series as well as different areas of research into levelling up. I mentioned a bit earlier, we have indeed this Wednesday at lunchtime Richard Jones talking about levelling up R&D and innovation that we were just talking about. We have further lectures planned on health and obesity and levelling up, Raghib Ali, schooling and levelling up with Amanda Spielman. We have other talks as well. Anyway, so thank you to our speakers. Thanks to everybody for bearing with the slight hitches. Do we still clap at the end of events? I guess so. Why not? Just to prove there are a few people here. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone. Thanks.